Okay. Thanks very much. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Psynergy Mental Health. It's an organization that I've worked with for a number of years based in the UK. And they've developed basically mental health surveys in conjunction with scientists and mental health experts at Cambridge, working with the National Health Service in the UK, basically to look at organizational health and then individual health within the organization. Because too many organizations don't understand well-being within the workplace, and they've also developed this in the sporting space as well. So how can sporting organizations better understand mental health and well-being within the organization? And I hate that our Liverpool supporter from yesterday is not here, because Ricky is a season ticket holder for Liverpool as well, so he has a strong interest in football. But Psynergy also provided some financial support to help this conference succeed, so I want to thank them very much.
Hi, my name is Rick, and I'm the CEO of Psynergy Mental Health. We are proud sponsors of Business and Development in Women's Football Conference, and I hope you're looking forward to the session on mental health in women's football. I wrote down a few words about what the Women's World Cup means to me and how I see things regarding it. I cannot begin to imagine the amount of mental strength, determination, resilience shown by these incredible female athletes who are taking the world stage to represent their countries in this World Cup. They're extremely inspiring, and they understand, and they should understand, that their efforts are inspiring millions of young girls across the world to take up the beautiful game. And so their triumphs extend far beyond just the football field. They really are changing the world with this. At times, they will show their vulnerability and courage to overcome this, whilst they share aspects of their mental health journey on the field. This is helping to break down stigmas and will empower others to come forward if they need help, etc. Not only that, but the amount of teamwork involved in football in general and the togetherness proves that mental health goes beyond just the individual. It's about fostering a positive and supportive environment to allow others or everyone within your team to flourish, which I think is just amazing. All in all, we celebrate, the entire world celebrates this World Cup, and it's a symbol of the strength of the human mind and power of unity and the inclusivity that this fantastic tournament brings. I hope you have a great session. I hope it goes well, and I'm cheering on the Lionesses, so come on England.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll move directly into the panel.
Hi everyone. Hi. I am so sorry. I was running late because I have a 16-year-old son. Yay! So, my name is Georgie. I'll be facilitating this shared conversation around mental health and wellbeing in women's soccer, and the way in which we understand our respective roles and how we as a broader community can further facilitate a holistic response, an inclusive response, a response that is sustainable and creates outcomes that is helpful. So what we're going to do, we're going to do some brief introductions before we start this shared conversation. So I really want to ensure that this panel discussion includes yourselves as well. It's one thing for us to speak at yourselves, but we'd love for you to be involved in also this shared conversation around the topic area that we are discussing this morning. So I've got 3 quick questions that I'm going to ask our panel to provide answers for. I can just imagine me falling back off the stage. That would be hilarious, wouldn't it? Okay, so the questions are: name, who are you representing, so your role and responsibility, and one thing that you can't live without. So name, roles and responsibilities, and one thing that you can't live without. One.
I have to go first.
2.
All right, on the spot. Okay, name I can do. I'm Sarah Zip. And there's a lot of Sarahs, so if you get confused, you can just call me Zip. Okay, I'm very fast. I'm here representing Mount St. Mary's University in the United States, as well as my other project, which is Power to Play period. So I do menstrual health and mental health.
Nice.
Yeah, right. Those are my 2 stickers on my computer, mental health and menstrual health. This is my brain as a program. Things I can't live without. I want to say something nice about like my family, but really it's coffee.
Yeah. Charlie, what's your coffee water?
It's very black,
It's right there. Awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
bitter like my heart.
Wow, we're really getting insights this morning.
I'm Katrina Wallstrom with the United States Sports Academy. My background is organizational development and change. I did some postgrad work in business psychology as well. The one thing I can't live without, I have 2 Siberian Huskies. I love them. They're great. No.
How old are they?
4 and 1.
Wow, cuteness overload.
Yes.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Lots of fur.
Yeah, imagine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Katrina Fraser, personal pronoun she, her. I'm representing the University of Sydney, discipline of exercise sports science, where I am a lecturer. My background is sport, exercise, and performance psychology. I'm trained sport and exercise scientist in applied sports psychology, and that's what I also do. I consult, I work with high performance mostly, athletes and coaches, and helping them to improve on pitch and off pitch as well. One thing I cannot live without, well, since Sienna mentioned coffee already, actually gonna say exercise. I cannot live without exercise, and I know if I don't do exercise, I'm not at my best. So exercise is my go-to.
Nice, thank you so much.
Right. My name is Anthea Clark. I work at La Trobe University in Melbourne. I'm a teaching and research academic, and my main areas are in that high performance female athlete space, and very much around creating environments that properly support those female athletes. The thing that I can't live without is sleep. I'm a good 10-hour plus, maybe some naps on weekends. So you don't want to see me without that.
Awesome, thank you, thank you. And my name is Chochi Wahua. I'm a full professor in social work and policy studies and chair of social work and policy studies here at the University of Sydney. One thing I can't live without is my afro comb. Literally, it goes everywhere with me. So literally, I love it. It's interesting, this whole thing around one things that we can't live without is an important part of that well-being perspective, right? This idea of what makes good mental health. Before we do that, though, I would like to also, as part of our formal introductions, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we are gathered. Here on the University of Sydney, we're located on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. To also acknowledge that the lands in which we are gathered, they are still considered stolen, as sovereignty was never ceded. And to further reiterate an ongoing commitment to work collaboratively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, I always try and give myself I'll give a practical example of how I'm holding myself accountable to that. As chair of social work and policy studies here at the University of Sydney, I really want to ensure that all of our units of study are inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, being, becoming, not just one unit of study. And I genuinely believe I've done a lot of research on how Pacific Indigenous perspectives can be meaningfully included. I'm from an Indigenous Pacific background. My father's Ipoh Fijian. How Indigenous knowledges can be utilised in mental health and wellbeing. And I genuinely believe we can learn a lot from First Nations Australians and First Nations in our respective countries that we are representing and coming from. So let's all be mindful of how that can be included in our conversations around wellbeing and things that we can't keep in the house. So my first formal question to the panel, and I really want this to be, again, a conversation with yourself. So if you've got questions that you might also want to ask to the panel, please start to think through that, because we'd love to hear from you as well. But my first formal question to the panel is, why? Why is this an important area of the game? Why do we do this sort of work? I should also mention my attachment to the sport is I work with the National Rugby League. I've been working with Rugby League for the last 13 years or so, also the Rugby Union. So I've been involved in the mental health space with these codes for a while, including Women in Rugby League. So why do we need to invest in this as a sporting code, but also as part of that shared approach in the community?
I'll start because I have the mic. I mean, in the high performance space, I'd say traditionally we haven't been very good at this, and it's very much been a focus on how can we pull the most out of our athletes and almost get them to that breaking point, that line where we can get best performance without having them completely break, maybe moderately break or break after a season, that's okay. And it's a real recent shift of thinking about mental health and well-being for those individuals. But logically, if you don't have good well-being, if you don't have good mental health where you can be resilient to changes or losses or injuries, how on earth are we going to get the best performance from those individuals, and a good performance that isn't just looking at a single game or a single season, but enables a lifelong enjoyment and getting the most out of that sporting career, and also the most out of that enjoyment of sport that goes beyond just where the professional level stops, and that they continue to exercise and be involved from that health perspective now rather than performance. So I'd say it's been a recent shift in the high performance space, but a much needed one.
Spot on. If we want our performance to perform and deliver, we cannot deliver if they're not ready to deliver physically and mentally. How many of you have heard this very cheesy saying, when it comes to a start line, 90% of who's gonna win comes to mental preparation? And how many of you actually worked on your mental preparation or worked on mental preparation with your athletes? So when it comes to a start line, it's too late to do that work, right? So mental preparation, and I'm not saying mental health on purpose, because we have this stigma that mental health is poor mental health, good mental health, it's clinical diagnosis. I'm not a clinician, I don't have a clinical training. My training is performance-based training. And that's very important to understand that all of us have performance in what it is we do. And in order for us to perform at our jobs at our best, we have to develop the skills to deal with those life stressors. The panel yesterday, I think in the afternoon, mentioned that professional female athletes, once we get signed to the clubs, and they can see some football players here already, so you can tell us a little bit more about your experiences. They are loaded physically to the point that have never experienced before. So you come from nothing to everything. Not only your body has to respond, but your mind has to respond. How will you cope with that stressor? In addition, how many of us experience school load, workload, full training load, family commitments, dealing with something else that's happening in our lives, coming to the pitch, whatever sport you play, and really failing to leave everything behind? And where your mind wanders is, what are going to cook my kids for dinner? What else they need to do for tomorrow? How many more assignments they need to mark? And where did I park the car? And I'm going to get a penalty or not, especially around in this area. On top of that, if I'm menstruating, Like, can anyone see it or not? Where's the toilet? They need to go and change, right? So we've got all those different barriers associated with that. My point being, it's not only about performance and mental health on the pitch, it's very much about what's happening off the pitch as well. So when we talk about mental health, we have to take into consideration the whole person, what's happening with that person in personal life. Do we have supportive families? Or do the families say like, well, you're going abroad overseas to play, you better don't come back home, we can't support you. That's the challenge itself. How are we gonna manage that? So we really need to look at the whole picture and shift away from this clinical mental health. Are you clinically diagnosed to, these are the life stressors, they're going to increase. I see going to more professional leagues. Can we help you to transition? Can we help you to transition from local league to, I don't know, state league, from state to national, from national to international, right? On top of that, how can we help you to develop your social identity to transition away from sport? What else can you do to feel your whole you? Because otherwise mental health suffers. So it's a very long answer with very, I guess, complex layers around it. But for me, it's very important to set that picture over here that we need to look beyond the pitch and beyond that clinical mental health.
I'm going to piggyback off of what Katrina just said. You really can't separate your mental health from your physical health. It is all connected. It's a system. And so when we're trying to do that, we're not taking into account the whole person. And so I think that's what a lot of the problem is that we really have to focus on the whole athlete, not just their athletic career, but also their personal lives. And how do we incorporate that? It's kind of the same with work-life balance. Like, no, it's our whole life. And how can we work with that in conjunction so that we can build a better person, not just on the field, but off the field as well.
Because there's no health without mental health.
Exactly.
All right, I'll keep it brief. I am working with girls and I'm worried that girls drop out of sport in adolescence. And there's a lot of factors for that, but basically if they're not having fun, if they're not in a good place mentally, they're not going to enjoy themselves, they're not going to stay in sport. So how do we create environments that are supportive, that are fun, engaging, to keep girls in, whether or not they go on to play in the World Cup or play on the national team or whatever, or if they're just playing and having fun, and that's good for them socially and developmentally, that's good enough.
Awesome. My next formal question, again, encouraging yourselves to think through principal questions that yourselves have. Why does gender matter in the context of mental health, well-being, sports? Why does it matter?
Okay, just also building on that point, girls face different barriers. And there's a lot of different barriers, pressures around body image, menstruation, as you mentioned. And whenever I talk about menstruation and the mental health and emotional aspects, I always list the physical aspects first, because if you're going through fatigue, pain, overheating, all of these physical things are happening, of course, that's going to have a bearing on your mental health and well-being too. But I think specifically around gender, there's so many different barriers and pressures that girls and women face. And so we have to look at that as part of their whole experience.
And kind of going more into that, it kind of goes more into the socio-cultural aspect of it, that we have defined gender roles. At least in the United States, we have an expectation of how a woman is supposed to present herself, how is she supposed to behave in an environment. Well, I'm not supposed to look too muscular because I need to look sexy, I need to look feminine, whereas a man is supposed to be powerful and smart. So we actually like force those constructs, on women and specifically on our athletes, because they're having to deal with two different identities. What does society want me to do versus what do I want to do as a person? So it really does have an impact when it comes to the different gender disparities there.
It's very hard to follow up because you mentioned everything already. I guess what we need to look into and think about is that our sex, that is recorded at birth, male or female, is very much going to influence how other people think about and create that gendered understanding how we should or shouldn't be, right? So for someone who was born as a male, they would become a baby boy, they're dressed in blue, they're encouraged to run around, climb the trees, and so on, right? It's very traditional. And then they grow up with this attitude, I cannot show emotion, I have to be hyper-masculine. The way I approach athletes, it has to be tough. It's like old school toughness. And many of them are actually shifting away from that. And they don't want to be associated with that hyper-masculinity, but yet they feel that the culture asks them to be that way. So I'm talking about younger generation. Now, if you are born as a female, you're assigned female at birth, and you grow up being expected to be a girl. So you're dressed in pink, and you're playing with Barbie dolls and Barbie pink, and you have to sit still and be well-behaved girls because ladies behave in this way, right? You've got all those different expectations put around you. And that translates into elite sport as well, where we've got binary classifications, where suddenly, you know, the gender experiences you brought with you throughout the life are discounted as physiological differences, even though they're very gendered reasons why you potentially have less experience, less access to knowledge, training, all those different barriers we spoke about yesterday. Right? On top of that, we also have to think about people who are gender diverse, who are non-binary, who are Aboriginal, for example, and how they express their gender. Right? Where do they fit in? So suddenly we've got this very binary classification of everything, very binary understanding of everything, and some people don't feel that they belong. Right? You want me to be masculine, but I'm not. You want me to be feminine, but I'm not. How does that make me happier? It doesn't. I'm bullied. I'm experiencing all those like teasing around. I want to withdraw. Right? I'm a very unhappy person. So we really have to look at the past binary understanding and include everyone in this conversation.
I'm going to add to all of that and touching on all of those points. When we think about high performance environment and the people that are looking after our athletes, if we have men in those roles who don't understand the context of some of that other things that are contributing to the mental health and the mental load that that individual is having to face, how on earth are they able to adequately support that individual? So I think that talks a lot to making sure that we've got diversity in our support systems for those athletes to be able to turn to, because, you know, different people are going to connect and understand different experiences of individuals, and improving that knowledge of what's potentially coming into play for those athletes is really important. If we think about the professionalization of women's sport, there is a massive personal load on those athletes that they need to promote themselves through social media. It's about their own generation of information and support and engagement with those with supporters, which is great, but that's another load that we're putting on those athletes that they then have to deal with, and they're also opening themselves up for massive amounts of potential abuse and people putting their opinions in, where, you know, our male athletes don't have to deal with that because they've got social media profiles that are doing that role for them, and they can be that barrier and that filter that our female athletes are potentially missing. So if we don't have the support for those female athletes, and this is where gender comes in rather than sex, helping those female athletes navigate all those extra things that perhaps comes onto them as a role that we don't capture in any other way for our athletes is super important.
And goes to the first point that you made from the first question, is that if we don't support that holistic, like everyone's been saying actually, view of what's really happening in space and place for our female athletes, then they're not mentally well. We're not supporting their well-being in a holistic way. Questions from yourselves? Yes. Okay, yes.
I'm curious in the high performance space, how you advise the coach when there's a level of needing to push your players versus having to honor their mental health, and knowing that in order to reach a higher level, you do have to put yourself in uncomfortable zones. How would you advise a coach in this case?
I'd say it's not necessarily the coach's role to deal with that, all of that themselves anyway. And you almost want an intermediary between it. An athlete isn't always going to love their coach, and they're going to have to be pushed and do some hard things, and a coach has to make tough decisions, and maybe an athlete doesn't make a team that week. It's hard, like we focus in here on our athlete's perspective and the importance of mental health for our athletes, but we also need to consider mental health about our coaches and all of our support staff. Like, it can be challenging for them as well. And so making sure that they've got systems in place, and so everyone needs a point of separation so that we can go to someone who isn't that. And you know, sometimes it's going to be hard, but the idea is that that pressure eases off and it gets easier. It becomes a challenge when the pressure is on everyone constantly all the time, and there's no release of that. So that's where someone needs to be checking over that sort of system.
Yeah, and on top of that, I would say you have to think about another two factors. One is that skills, coping skills, have to be developed from early ages. It's not like we'll just wait until you become a national, international level athlete and then they'll start working on your mental skills. That's way too late, right? All those fundamental skills, they need to be started developing at very early age. Self-organization, self-management, dealing with failure, how you prep for your match, what do you do, right? What pre-shot routines do you go through, right? What is right for you? On top of that, the culture has to be behind that. So as a coach, I would say you have to promote that growth mindset environment, which basically means it's okay to fail. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. That's why they're doing this, right? So we're gonna push your skills, your physical skills, we're gonna push your mental skills, try to do this. From players' point of view, what I see and what I hear behind the closed doors in team environment, they don't want to be seen as we're weak, right? Because selection is up to the hand. So if I come to the coach or to the psych and say, hey, I'm struggling, you're gonna go and talk to someone else and you're gonna influence my selection. I understand confidentiality, I understand it's kind of between you and I, but they still have that preconceived idea. That's why I'm saying it's up to the culture created in that environment that failing is part of your development. How do you deal with that, right? Precious training, make mistakes on purpose, focus on recovering after you made a mistake, right? So you can't avoid making mistakes, can you? It's more important how you recover from that. So really playing out with situations with athletes, explaining why you're doing that, why you want them to fail, and how that's going to help them to become better players, then it counts.
I think that we're putting a lot of pressure on the coaches, that we're kind of focusing on this in isolation, that it's more of a community perspective. There needs to be an infrastructure put into place so that if we do have a challenge with an athlete, that there is a system and policies and rules in place that the coach can actually fall back on. I think that we don't have that, at least not in the United States. We don't have those structures. We don't have those licensed clinical psychologists to kind of get that information to the coaches. It's not just coaches, it's actually the teammates, it's the family members, it's everybody. Majority of the time, if I'm going to have some type of mental issue, I may not go straight to my coach. I may go to my teammate, I may go to a friend. So having all of those parameters and that infrastructure in place, we have to start focusing on that, not just at the coach level, but the entire environment, all the way up to those NGOs. Like, we have to start paying attention to that and building that for them.
Okay, yes, and then we'll come to the end. Thank you.
This is sort of similar to Breeze, but just maybe more specific. But what about an athlete, and in this particular scenario, I'm talking about high performance, but who needs the mental space, but you're also worried about their continued isolation. So think after long-term injuries or multiple injuries and just taking more and more space, to the point that you're a bit worried that they've taken too much space from the environment, and you want them to be part of it, but they feel like it's too much to be around the team.
I feel like people are looking at me for some reason. I'll take it from the team. It's a very tough one. It's very, very tough one. It depends on the culture, right? So when we talk about injury and psychology of injury, you've got three phases. One is pre-injury, and whether you had that support from someone pre-injury, you had that rapport developed. Then you've got onset of injury. So for example, as a side, did you start working with that person when they got injured? Or during the recovery, which kind of bleeds into stage 3 and transition back into the sport, right? Because the recovery is part of that transition back. The common advice is make sure that they still feel as part of the team. They attend the sessions, they know what's happening, they interact with their mates, they go to social events. However, a caveat there is that some sports and some teams, and unfortunately, mostly female athletes, for some reason, they make it very, very clear you're injured and not part of the team. So that really forces that person to withdraw because I cannot play. Someone is threatening my position. I'm not part of the team. And you've got this social aspect. Come and hang out with us after training. But you're not really at training, right? So can't really come and hang out. So it just creates that distance. From the injured player's point of view, how do you come back? Because you're weak, right? Someone is going after you. It's a very unique situation. I can't give you one, I guess, a silver bullet saying, try this. It's very much engaging with that person, really unpacking what's happening at our team culture, from coaches' point of view, from club's point of view, really trying to engage them back as much as possible. Doing rehab on the pitch, being part of the communications, having something else to do to make sure that they're constantly across what's happening, but then organizing social events, organizing activities, team building activities, which are off the pitch and that person can engage with and start feeling this belonging with the team. Yeah.
I like to piggyback. I have a story. So I had a student that shared with me that she suffered a skull fracture during softball. They took her to the hospital. She had a several-day recovery, and they reintroduced her back into the sport. She played, she wasn't doing as well, and then she kind of went into PTSD. She was afraid to be on the pitch. She couldn't function, she was breaking down. And so it's a very complex type of situation. And I think it's an individualized situation because things can develop after the fact that, people didn't take into account. So it's kind of getting into the mental surveys, that they were kind of talking about earlier, and keeping track of, we'll meet you where you are, but we want you to rest and we want you to recover. And that sense of belonging, having those team building activities, really keeping them incorporated so that they know they're still part of the team. Like I said, it's an individualized situation. We like to make things very black and white, and humans, we're just so complex. We just can't go that route so much sometimes. So we got to kind of, take a look at the gray areas as well.
The only other thing I'll say is I think it's super important that you almost don't let that athlete fall away in the first place. And maybe it's potentially easier in a high performance environment where there is more support structures and money and people available to help avoid that. And it certainly gets harder in lower levels or with less support available. But the idea is that I think you don't want, if someone has an injury or there's some other thing going on, you don't want them to have that initial disconnect, because it's always going to be harder to reconnect from there. And that comes down to culture as well. In a high performance sport environment, there's a lot of monitoring of athletes that happen now, and mental health monitoring is becoming far more regular. But what's really important with mental health monitoring is that if you're going to do it, you've got a good system in place that enables that referral process if something does get flagged or something happens. The worst thing that you could be doing is monitoring for mental health. Something gets flagged and that athlete doesn't hear anything and nothing changes for them. That's a really scary environment that you want to avoid to all,
Yeah, because it goes to that broader point of the infrastructure and the culture, because you could actually be proactive and actually enable people to feel safe or being able to have a diagnosis and disclose. But if it's tokenistically done, and then we don't have the culture and the infrastructure then support that.
I think you can also say, like Alicia mentioned yesterday around nutrition, and that we don't want to use nutrition services as or it's because you're fat, or because there's something wrong, or there's an issue. It's the same with mental health.
Yes.
That it's a strength thing. You start developing that mental strategies and mental conditioning now, so that if anything happens, you've got some of those skills. But it's also normal that everyone is talking to those people and about those elements, that it's not this thing that only happens when something goes wrong.
Totally. And I agree, a lot of my work has been around being able to promote that everyone has a mental health. When we talk about mental health, people go, oh, illness.
Yeah.
But no, mental health, as we said, you've got all a level of physical health, you all have a level of mental health. So we all need to be proactive in our understanding of those things. Got a question up the back. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Rui's really onto something with coaches in high performance environments, national team coaches. These are ephemeral appointments. They just receive the system that's developed at players. They don't necessarily have a long time to fix the systemic problems that are delivering these talented athletes. So to Bruce's point, which I thought was a fantastic one, what's your advice for someone in this position as a coach? Historically, that was the role of a chaplain. Maybe that speaks to the history of muscular Christianity. It's a pastoral type thing where you can put whatever descriptors you want. But to answer Bruce's question, do you appoint a goalkeeper coach first or a Department of Good Times coach first? Graham Arnold got the bloke who created the Wiggles, Mike Conway, the coach from the Socceroos, to help with this stuff in the background. How important is this as your first appointment? I know it was a bit of a throwaway to get a goalkeeper coach on it, but you get my point, right? Who's there to pull the reins in on the coach to advise them to manage this stuff, to take that head away from the coach? Where is it in the pecking order of appointments? From a man or a woman who's in the high performance, win or lose, keep your job, lose your job, manage this situation. You've got no control over the system that brought these players to you.
Oh, you got the mic.
I mean, I would say culture starts with the coach, and that appointment is super important. I would never want to be in a coaching role. I think it's such a challenging role where you have stresses and competing interests from so many different areas, and there's always going to be someone that perceives what you've done as being incorrect or wrong or not the best way. I don't have an answer for you. It's a really challenging area, but I think it's about, we need to invest in those coaches, and we need to invest in the support structure around those coaches. If we think about mental health and well-being of coaches would be doing 60+ hours a week of work and thinking, and they're probably never quite switched off. So how on earth can they perform well in that role? So again, I think we've mentioned it in a couple of panels now. It probably comes back to the whole concept and idea of working in sport probably needs a bit of a shift as well, and we need to improve that whole system. But if you're in a high performance role and environment, you want to make sure that there's a number of support structures for your coach, and that your coach has the capacity to be able to create the right team and to be able to, I guess, switch off from some of those competing interests so that they can focus on the athlete. But, you know, focusing on an athlete and creating good culture, that there's a potential that means that their team's not going to win. And that's not their fault, because the recruiting of that team happened years previously, and so it's about the management of that in recognizing that that's not on the coach and that we need to be more supportive of those roles as well.
To add to that, I think if you want to get results, you want to see performance, you have to invest in people. And investing in people means investing in players, investing in coaches, investing in other support staff, dietitians, psychologists, mental health officers, strength and conditioning coaches, team managers, and so on, so that people are professionals. But it's not necessarily getting the top professional. It's about the best performing team. So it's about establishing your networks, knowing who you work well with, how you fit in, who you can go and ask for help, and how you can, lay those foundations from early on. But it's impossible to do that without good organizational support, right? It's very hard to do that, because what coaches tell us between the closed doors is that my family suffers, my kids hate my job because I constantly choose athletes over them, right? I'm expected to come home and become a mother, whilst on the field I'm challenged if I'm a good leader because I'm a mother, right? So it's going back to those unique challenges. So how do we help them to deal with that? On top of that, do you know enough about a female body, female athlete? Do you know enough about strength and conditioning? All those other challenges. So for me, everything starts with investing in people from very early on and establishing those networks where you create an expert team, not a team of experts, but an expert team on field who are kicking the ball and scoring the goals, but also who help that team off the pitch to deliver.
So building workforce capacity.
Very much so.
Ultimately, coaches are leaders, and leaders should actually surround themselves with people that are not just going to agree with them all the time, but that can give it to them straight. So yes, we definitely want to win, but you got to tell people the truth sometimes, like, hey, I know you want to do this, but in the best interest of this athlete, do you want them to be playing more games in the future, or do you want this one game right now? I think we have to make a differentiation between that we're looking at short term versus long term. And so we want to go for the long term, especially when you have great players. Great players are an asset. You have to invest in them just like we do with any other employee. We have to put the systems in place for them to be successful. And if we're not doing that, if that coach is not doing that, they're not a good leader, and we need to get somebody else.
Yeah, I think everything that they've said so far as well, but to add to that, bringing it back to a bit about women's experiences and what it means to support the whole person on a team and women. And I'm thinking of that episode in the Matildas when they bring the babies to camp, and that the coach Tony learned that from his time in the US women's national team. And I think those kinds of that kind of experience and knowledge needs to be translated better into our systems, because women have different needs, have different responsibilities and obligations, not just motherhood, but other caregiving roles and things like that. And when we can take that into account, we're not just looking at the whole person. Every person's different, and women are different, in their different experiences, but they might bring a different set of needs to the table.
And using that as a base of strength as opposed to a deficit.
Exactly. I mean, what can't moms do? What we're on here, that was a great panel last night. I don't know if anybody missed it, but Anthea and Alicia. Okay, there she is. Yeah. So talking about, the power of motherhood and the knowledge and the experience that comes with that. We saw Sasha on here earlier, that video from Sasha from Barbados. She and I just wrote a book chapter about the motherhood penalty in sport. And the reverse side of that is that there's a lot of learning and knowledge that can come from those experiences.
Yep. And should be included in the culture.
It should be valued
within the spaces in which women elite athletes and athletes generally should be seen, heard, made visible, known. I have a question over on this.
Yes, I don't want to burden this particular panel with this question, but I think it's a confidence. What I'm missing here is what is essential to all sports, mainly of what they're agonistic. I wasn't, not antagonistic, but agonistic, meaning they're constantly opposed. Two teams, two individuals, constant competition. This means that winning becomes very important. And this means that what has developed or existed all along is what I call the sports omerta. Okay? The quiet in sports, that it is this unbelievable pressure not to talk about things. And this is, of course, in almost every team has this. About women and men, you know, the terrible things that went on with Harvard hockey coach. So the question is, how do you deal with this? How do you, in fact, exit, as Albert personally called it, exit voice loyalty, the false social action. Sports emphasizes loyalty and disemphasizes exit. It took a long time for this horror Nasser, Larry Nasser, to emerge. This is, when you read about this, it's just insane. And it's not only someone actually really told me that I'm so furious about Nasser because the Michigan guy, he was Michigan State. No. It's deeper than that. So the point is, what makes that, what does this actually allow this to exist? Last point. In other words, that sports, because it's about clear winning and because it's clear achievement, allow a certain social, certain tenor speech. I'll give you another example. If I were to speak like any Michigan coach to my students, I would be fired. I would have been fired a long time ago. I mean, I go to these, it's just incredible. It's basically constant abuse. Now, maybe more in the football team than in the volleyball team, whatever. Okay? And it's absolutely tolerated because, why? Because they got to play on Saturday and they can prove whether they win or not. You know, whether my students understand the German social democracy well enough, whatever, it's unclear. So my point is that this thing about omerta, or this collective enforced silence, which is very much that everybody plays along with, is a crucial issue.
Thank you.
I think that's a really good point, and it's a really upsetting point to think about to some degree. But one of the things I think is true, but what we're seeing change, and not to be too optimistic about it or put on too much of a rose-colored tint, but we're seeing change. We're seeing more and more discussion about mental health. It's being more accepted to have weaknesses, to have needs for mental health. The stigma is dissipating. And I'm drawing a blank on the gymnast who backed out of the Olympics. Simone Biles, yes, thank you. Right, so a brilliant example of a person on the highest stage under the biggest pressure saying, no, this isn't it, this isn't working. So that was really wonderful, and I think that's helped engage coaches and athletes in that conversation. I think it's also interesting to see that comes from maybe coming more from the female side. In that specific example, but I think in general too.
I think that we're kind of looking at sport in isolation, but I think that it could come from other areas as well, from other people that are surrounding those players to give them a chance to kind of speak out, because now we know complacency is acceptance of what's going on, of the status quo. And all we need is one person to actually break the silence, and then a movement begins. And I think we've seen that kind of time and time again. Like there's that groupthink, the groupthink that we're all just going to agree, we're all going to be silent. I had an athlete tell me that, well, she asked me and says, I ate a bagel this morning and I'm wondering, like, how much of that did I actually digest? Well, I know what she was getting on about, you know, obviously. And then she asked the coach that, and he didn't say anything. And it's like, you have to break the silence. You have to say something. That's not okay. It's not appropriate. It's the same thing with body shaming. Like, we see it on social media and all the time right now. I actually sat behind a group of sixth graders that were body shaming another mother and saying, oh, she looks like the woman from Dance Moms, look at how fat she is, you know, and finally I was like, that's not appropriate. We don't talk about other people that way. We have to start educating. I think there's an education component to that, you know, we're so used to just doing the same thing, the same monotonous things. We're seeing it in society and we just keep spinning the wheel. And then finally, eventually it has to break. But I think that comes with education, that without education, we just keep doing the same things. Oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry. I was kind of like on a soapbox. I'm so sorry. But yeah, I think that it's really about education. It's about training. It's about letting people know that this is not okay. When we withhold education, that's when we keep things in the status quo. The same thing that's happening in the United States right now with the books. We're taking those things back because the less people know, the more we can control them.
I agree. So it's really about calling it out, isn't it?
Yes.
And making sure that we do create scope for those things to be actually called out. We do have one last quick question. Yes,
Yeah, can I just?
Gonna follow on from the two Andy's questions, so it may expand the answer a little bit. And that is, how much do we know, and in this case, maybe in terms of Australian or US schooling context, how do we know from an organizational perspective that we're doing the right things and promoting best practice, so that, you know, Andy's question about coaches and the developmental team gets solved by the knowledge being shared across the organization.
Yeah, so can we just bring conversation back to mental health, right? And that's exactly where you're coming from, right? Strength is being tough. Boys don't cry. Winners don't lose, right? Well, however you want to frame it. And if you're losing at half break, you're going into locker rooms, you get this tough love approach. You know, I grew up with that. This is how the sports school looked like. It's a tough love approach. If you're prescribed 80% of physical activity, is because you didn't train tough enough. This is why I have to do 80 and your heart is not responding well. Like, however we wanted to justify that. Right? And that just kept feeding in and feeding in and feeding in to the point that we kept silent. And that's our approach. But we need to change that, yes, into education, but from different point of view. It's not about saying that, here you go, we've got a mental referral network. We do mental health screening. If we identify that you're at risk, you meet criteria, here you go and speak to someone. It's up to you if you want to reach out or not. If you're a team player, you probably say, no, it's stigma again. Who gonna talk to? We're gonna tell my coaches, it's gonna affect my selection. And that's becoming a vicious cycle that we've been trying to break. So in order to reach more people and spread that education, let's bring someone in and create educational curriculum about mental skills, not even mental health, mental skills. What does it take to perform at elite level? Sure, strength and conditioning, mental health, coping skills. How do you develop that? Player number one, what do you do before you go out and play? How do you cope with challenge? What do you do when you're frustrated? Give us some strategies. Player number two, you share some strategies. As a coach, what do you do when your team is losing, when they're not making decisions you want them to make? Then someone else is pressuring you and your job is on the line. Because if you don't win, and that's what we're not talking about, the coach is gone. So they need that security as well. So that's what we really need to bring back into conversation and shift that change. So essentially, we're delivering the same product. They're packaging it in completely different words in completely different manner, and we're bringing more people on board with us by changing perspective. It's not about mental health, clinical mental health. It's not about mental well-being and just a person comes first. They have to deliver. How do we help them to deliver?
We've got 1 more minute left. And so I've got a one-word answer question for that. Yep. And if this is the question. You're in front of the heads of FIFA women. What is the one word you would say to them about women and mental health and well-being? One word.
Diversity, but I'm gonna quickly follow up. It answers that and it comes back to this. I think you need diversity of voice so that you can capture the experiences of many people and so that many people can feel comfortable in being able to say when something isn't quite right for them so that systems can change.
Awesome.
Diversity, that there are many different ways to approach the same things and all of them are okay because different people deal with things differently. So diversity in the skill set.
Narrative, because you control your own destiny and ultimately you're the one that has to live with that. So you have to create your own story.
Listen to what women have to say. There's not enough women in decision-making roles, especially at FIFA.
Join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Sorry.